Hey there. Tonight we're diving into one of the modern world's greatest conveniences, streaming video, but forget everything you know about instant 4 kelvins playback, unlimited content libraries, and seamless viewing across all your devices. We're about to explore the reality of early streaming services, where watching a 2-minute video could take 6 hours, where companies burned through billions of dollars, losing money on every single customer, and where the entire concept seemed so impossible that most tech experts predicted it would never work. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in a cramped office somewhere in Silicon Valley in the year 2005. And the first thing you notice isn't the exciting atmosphere of tech innovation or the revolutionary potential of streaming video. It's the sound of a dial-up modem screeching like a dying robot while attempting to load a 2-minute video clip that will buffer for approximately 6 hours before giving up entirely and displaying an error message that nobody can interpret. Your workspace looks nothing like the sleek Netflix offices you might have imagined. It's a converted warehouse with exposed pipes, flickering fluorescent lights, and rows of overheating servers that sound like jet engines preparing for takeoff. The air conditioning can't keep up with the heat generated by hundreds of computers attempting to stream video content over internet connections that were designed for email and basic web browsing, not multimedia delivery. The company you've apparently joined is one of dozens of streaming startups that are burning through venture capital at rates that would make lottery winners nervous, all chasing the dream of delivering video content over the internet, despite the minor technical problem that the internet infrastructure of 2005 cannot actually support this vision in any practical or economical way. Your desk contains a computer that costs $3,000 and still can't smoothly play video files larger than a few megabytes. The monitor displays something that's technically video but looks more like an animated PowerPoint presentation created by someone having a seizure. The compression artifacts are so severe that human faces resemble abstract art, and fast motion sequences become indistinguishable blurs of pixels. Jake, the chief technology officer whose permanently bloodshot eyes and coffee-stained shirt mark him as someone who hasn't slept properly in months, approaches with news that would be concerning if it weren't completely expected. The servers crashed again. He announces with the enthusiasm of someone reporting that water is wet. We had 12 simultaneous users, and the entire system went down. Also, we're burning through $10,000 a month just on bandwidth costs. And that's with the video compressed so much it looks like Minecraft. This is when you learn that early streaming services operate according to economic principles that violate every rule of sustainable business. The company loses approximately $5 for every $1 of revenue generated. Bandwidth costs alone exceed subscription fees by factors that would bankrupt most businesses within weeks. The technology requires infrastructure investments that won't be economically viable for another decade. But venture capitalists are investing anyway based on the theory that someone will eventually figure out how to make the business model work. The technical challenges facing streaming services in 2005 make modern software problems seem like minor inconveniences. Internet speeds available to most Americans top out at around 1 megabit per second, which is sufficient for loading web pages but completely inadequate for streaming video content. Even at maximum compression, a movie file requires several gigabytes of data that would take days to download over typical home internet connections. The video compression technology available in 2005 represents a painful trade-off between file size and watchable quality. Compress the video enough to make streaming theoretically possible, and the result looks like security camera footage from a convenience store robbery. Maintain quality sufficient for comfortable viewing, and the file sizes become impossibly large for internet delivery. There's no middle ground where both requirements can be satisfied simultaneously. Server capacity represents another economic nightmare that makes the business model completely unsustainable. Each simultaneous video stream requires dedicated server resources that cost real money to maintain. Scale up to handle peak demand. And you're paying for server capacity that sits idle most of the time. Scale down to reduce costs, and your service becomes unusable during popular viewing hours when everyone tries to stream simultaneously. Content delivery networks. The infrastructure that makes modern streaming possible barely exist in 2005 and don't work reliably when they do exist. The theory is that distributing video files across multiple servers in different geographic locations will reduce bandwidth costs and improve streaming performance. The reality is that CDN technology is immature, expensive, and prone to failures that make video playback even more unreliable than it would be with simple, direct delivery. The company's business plan, if it can be called that, involves providing streaming video to customers at prices that don't cover even a fraction of the actual costs, while hoping that technology improvements and scale economies will eventually make the model profitable. This strategy requires unlimited venture capital funding, infinite patience from investors, and faith that technical breakthroughs will occur on schedules that align with the company's runway before money runs out. Your job description includes responsibilities that reveal the desperate nature of early streaming operations. You'll be spending your days refreshing server dashboards to monitor crashes, fielding angry customer complaints about poor video quality, and attending meetings where executives discuss pivoting the business model because the current approach clearly isn't working. But nobody has better ideas. The competitive landscape includes dozens of similar companies, all pursuing the same impossible vision with slightly different approaches that are equally unprofitable. Some focus on user-generated content, others on licensed professional content. Some attempt ad-supported models, others subscription-based services. All of them are losing spectacular amounts of money while competing for the attention of customers who mostly prefer just downloading videos illegally or renting DVDs from Blockbuster. The customer experience reveals why streaming adoption remains limited to early adopters with high tolerance for technical problems. Signing up for the service requires providing credit card information through payment systems that fail regularly. Finding content involves navigating website interfaces that look like they were designed in 1998. Actually watching content requires patience that most humans don't possess as videos buffer, stutter, crash, and generally provide experiences that make broadcast television seem technologically advanced. The video quality available through streaming in 2005 makes YouTube's lowest resolution setting look like IMAX by comparison. Most streams deliver video at resolutions of 320 by 240 pixels, which is smaller than a postage stamp on modern displays. The frame rates rarely exceed 15 frames per second, creating motion that looks like stop-motion animation. The audio quality resembles AM radio being played through a tin can telephone. Browser compatibility represents another layer of technical hell that makes streaming even more complicated than it needs to be. Internet Explorer requires different video players than Firefox, which uses different technology than Safari. Each browser handles streaming protocols differently, creating situations where content works perfectly in one browser but completely fails in others. Customers receive no guidance about which browser to use, leading to support nightmares where troubleshooting begins with determining what software combination the customer is attempting to use. Mobile streaming in 2005 exists only in the fever dreams of executives who don't understand that cell phones of this era can barely load text-based web pages, let alone stream video content. The bandwidth available on mobile networks makes dial-up internet look fast by comparison. The processing power in mobile devices couldn't decode compressed video, even if bandwidth weren't a limiting factor. The screen sizes make video viewing impractical, even if the technical problems could be solved. The office culture reflects the dysfunction of a business model that doesn't work, being pursued by people who believe it will eventually work through sheer determination and unlimited VC funding. Employees work 100-hour weeks, not because they're passionate about streaming video, but because the company is perpetually in crisis mode, trying to prevent complete collapse. Stock options that represent ownership in a company losing millions monthly feel more like lottery tickets than actual compensation. As your first week at the streaming startup ends, you've witnessed 3 major server crashes, handled dozens of angry customer complaints about video quality, and attended 5 meetings where executives discussed pivoting the business model because current approaches clearly aren't sustainable. The company has burned through $500,000 while generating approximately $50,000 in revenue, a ratio that would bankrupt most businesses, but is considered acceptable in the world of venture-funded tech startups. Tonight, you'll go home to an apartment you can barely afford because your startup salary consists primarily of worthless stock options. And you'll try to relax by watching Netflix DVDs delivered through the mail, because streaming your own company's service is too frustrating to tolerate. Tomorrow will bring more server crashes, more customer complaints, and more evidence that streaming video over the internet might be technologically impossible given current infrastructure limitations. Welcome to the world of early streaming services, where revolutionary technology meets economic reality and loses spectacularly, where customer satisfaction comes second to surviving another month of operation, and where the future of entertainment requires believing in possibilities that current technology cannot actually deliver. Your second week at the streaming startup begins with a meeting that will define everything wrong with the early streaming industry: the content, licensing, negotiation. Sarah, the head of business development, whose permanent stress lines and collection of anxiety medications mark her as someone who spends her days negotiating with Hollywood lawyers, calls an all-hands meeting to explain why the company's content library consists of exactly 17 movies, none of which anyone has ever heard of or would voluntarily watch. The fundamental problem facing streaming services becomes immediately apparent. Nobody who owns desirable content wants to license it for streaming. The major Hollywood studios view streaming as a threat to their highly profitable DVD sales and theatrical releases. Television networks consider streaming competition for their broadcast and cable distribution. Content owners who do agree to license material for streaming demand terms so ridiculous that the economics make lottery tickets look like sound investments. The licensing negotiation process reveals an entertainment industry structure designed specifically to prevent new distribution methods from disrupting established business models. Every piece of content involves multiple rights holders who must all agree before streaming can occur. The studio owns distribution rights, but actors have contractual approval over new formats. Directors' guilds require additional payments for streaming distribution. Music licensing requires separate negotiations for every song in every scene of every movie or show. Sarah explains the licensing deal she just spent 3 months negotiating with a minor studio that owns a catalog of B-movies from the 1980s. The terms require paying $1 million upfront for the right to stream their entire catalog of 23 movies, but only if the streaming service agrees to limit each movie to no more than 100 streams. This creates a situation where the company pays approximately $10,000 per individual viewing of movies that no sane person would pay $10 to watch. Geographic restrictions add another layer of complexity that makes international expansion nearly impossible. Content licensed for streaming in the United States cannot be streamed in Canada without separate negotiations and additional payments. European rights require country-by-country licensing deals, each with different terms and conditions. The same movie might require dozens of separate licensing agreements to make it legally streamable worldwide, with costs that make global distribution economically insane. Release windows represent Hollywood's preferred method of maximizing revenue while preventing streaming from becoming viable. New movies must wait 6 months after theatrical release before becoming available for home video. Streaming rights come only after DVD and pay-per-view windows, typically meaning content becomes available for streaming 5 years after theatrical release when nobody cares about watching it anymore. By the time streaming services can license recent content, it's no longer recent and has minimal audience appeal. The negotiation process itself would test the patience of Buddhist monks. Every licensing deal requires involvement of approximately 50 lawyers, representing different parties with different interests. The studios send teams of negotiators whose primary goal seems to be making streaming as difficult and expensive as possible while technically agreeing to license content. The meetings involve legal terminology that nobody outside entertainment law understands, and contract terms that fill hundreds of pages with provisions designed to protect every possible studio interest. Rights management creates operational nightmares that make technical problems seem simple by comparison. Music licensing requires tracking every song and every piece of content, and negotiating separate streaming rights with record labels and composers. Some songs can be streamed in some territories, but not others, requiring multiple versions of the same content with different soundtracks for different regions. The metadata required to manage these restrictions becomes so complex that no existing database system can handle it reliably. Actor residuals represent another financial horror that makes streaming economics even more impossible. Traditional media pays actors residuals based on broadcast airings or DVD sales, using formulas established through decades of union negotiation. Streaming requires new residual structures that nobody knows how to calculate fairly. Should actors receive payment per stream, per subscriber? Based on what portion of the content each subscriber watches, every possible formula creates accounting nightmares and financial obligations that make the business model even more unprofitable. Territory restrictions create technical requirements that most streaming platforms cannot meet. Content licensed for the United States must be geo-blocked from Canadian viewers, requiring IP address detection that doesn't work reliably and VPN detection that doesn't exist yet. Customers traveling internationally expect to access their streaming accounts, but licensing terms prohibit this, creating support nightmares when Americans in Europe can't watch content they're paying for. Expiration chaos represents the operational disaster that occurs when licensing deals expire. Content disappears from streaming libraries without warning when licensing terms end, enraging customers who started watching series that vanish mid-season. Renewing licenses requires completely new negotiations with terms that often change dramatically. The uncertainty makes it impossible to build loyal audiences around specific content when that content might disappear at any moment. Your company attempts to solve the content problem by creating original programming, which sounds innovative until you learn the budget constraints. The company allocates $50,000 per episode for original content, which is less than most YouTube creators spend on production. The result is content that looks like public access television from the 1980s. With production values so low, they make the licensing deals for B-movies seem like good investments. The search for content creators willing to work for streaming budgets reveals that nobody with professional experience wants to risk their reputation on platforms that nobody watches. The production talent available at streaming price points consists primarily of aspiring filmmakers who lack the skills and experience to create watchable content. The scripts are terrible. The acting is worse, and the production quality makes home videos seem professionally produced. The few original productions that get completed face distribution problems that make the content licensing issues seem simple. Nobody watches original streaming content because nobody knows it exists, and those who discover it generally wish they hadn't. The production investments become complete losses with no path to recouping costs through licensing to other platforms or international distribution. Technical encoding represents another disaster that makes content delivery even more complicated than licensing. Every piece of content must be encoded in multiple formats to work across different browsers, devices, and connection speeds. The encoding process is expensive, time-consuming, and prone to errors that make content unwatchable. Videos encoded for high-quality playback don't work on slow connections. Videos compressed for slow connections look terrible on any screen large enough to see clearly. Format wars add additional complexity as competing video technologies battle for dominance without consensus about which approach will eventually win. Flash video works in some browsers but not others. Windows Media requires plugins that many users don't have. Real Player still exists for reasons nobody can explain. QuickTime works on Macs but creates problems on Windows. Every format choice alienates some potential viewers while providing adequate experience for nobody. Browser compatibility testing reveals that content working perfectly in Internet Explorer might be completely broken in Firefox. And vice versa. Safari handles video differently than either Windows browser, requiring separate testing and often separate encoding. The permutations of browsers, operating systems, plugins, and connection speeds create millions of possible configurations, each requiring testing that the company doesn't have resources to perform. Mobile streaming represents a fantasy that executives discuss despite the complete impossibility of implementation given current technology. Cell phones in 2005 cannot decode compressed video with processing power measured in megahertz rather than gigahertz. Mobile network bandwidth makes dial-up internet look fast. Screen sizes make video viewing impractical, even if the technical problems could be solved. Yet executives continue planning mobile strategies because admitting that mobile streaming won't work for another decade sounds defeatist. Quality trade-offs create no-win situations where every decision disappoints some customers. Stream at high enough quality to be watchable, and buffering makes the experience intolerable. Compress enough to reduce buffering, and video quality becomes so poor that customers complain. Optimize for fast connections, and most potential customers can't use the service. Optimize for slow connections, and the video looks like abstract art created by malfunctioning robots. As your second week ends, the company has licensed 3 additional movies nobody wants to watch, spent $200,000 on original content that makes community theater look professional, and attended 17 meetings about rights management problems that have no solutions given current legal and technical constraints. The content library remains embarrassingly small, and the licensing costs make profitability mathematically impossible, even if customer adoption increased by factors of 10. Tonight, you'll go home and think about how Hollywood built a system specifically designed to prevent distribution innovation while protecting established business models, and how streaming services must navigate this system while also solving technical problems that might not have solutions. Tomorrow will bring more licensing negotiations, more format compatibility issues, and more evidence that content acquisition represents an even larger problem than the technical challenges that already seem insurmountable. The streaming revolution that seemed inevitable and obvious in theory keeps running into reality where studios control content, lawyers control negotiations, and economics favor maintaining existing distribution methods rather than enabling new ones that threaten established profits. Your third week at the streaming startup begins with a sound that will become hauntingly familiar. The phone ringing in the customer support center at 7 in the morning with someone screaming about how they've been trying to watch a movie for 3 hours and have only successfully viewed 47 seconds of actual content. Welcome to the customer experience team, where your job involves apologizing for technical problems you don't understand to customers whose frustration is completely justified. The user interface of the streaming website reveals why most visitors leave within seconds of arriving. The homepage looks like it was designed by someone whose only web design experience involved creating MySpace pages in the late 90s. Navigation requires clicking through multiple poorly organized menus to find content. The search functionality operates according to mysterious algorithms that seem designed to prevent users from finding what they're looking for. Categories are labeled with terms that nobody uses. And the featured content highlights movies that the company desperately wants people to watch rather than content that people actually want to see. The account creation process demonstrates the first of many ways that streaming services make simple tasks unnecessarily complicated. Creating an account requires providing personal information through forms that don't work properly in half the available browsers. The password requirements demand combinations of characters that most people cannot remember but aren't strong enough to actually protect accounts. Email verification requires clicking links in messages that often end up in spam folders, leaving users unable to access accounts they've just created. Payment processing represents a special circle of hell where entering credit card information feels like participating in Russian roulette. The payment gateway fails approximately 20% of the time for reasons that nobody can diagnose. Successful payments sometimes process twice, charging customers multiple times for single subscriptions. Declined payments often result from the system incorrectly flagging legitimate transactions as fraud, while simultaneously approving actual fraudulent charges that create financial losses for the company. The customer database illustrates the catastrophic consequences of rapid growth without proper infrastructure planning. User accounts contain incorrect information because the sign-up forms didn't validate data properly. Email addresses are misspelled, making communication impossible. Passwords are stored using security practices that would make computer science professors weep. Personal information gets mixed between accounts when database errors assign one customer's data to another customer's profile. Website performance makes the video streaming problems seem minor by comparison. Pages take 30 seconds to load because the site attempts to display high-resolution images over connections designed for text. Links break regularly because the development team deploys updates without testing. Shopping cart functionality fails mid-transaction, causing customers to abandon purchases and swear off the service forever. Session management problems log users out randomly, requiring them to sign in repeatedly during single browsing sessions. The recommendation algorithm represents perhaps the most visible failure of early streaming technology. The system suggests content based on what can only be described as random chance disguised as artificial intelligence. Watch a romantic comedy and receive recommendations for horror movies. View a documentary and get suggestions for cartoons designed for children. The algorithm seems to operate according to the principle that any content is equally likely to interest any viewer, which is technically democracy but practically useless. Search functionality deserves special recognition for making content discovery nearly impossible, despite having a search box prominently displayed. Typing exact movie titles returns results that don't include the movie being searched for. The search ranking algorithm prioritizes content the company wants to promote over content users want to find. Spelling mistakes produce no results rather than suggestions. Because spell check technology apparently represents an unsolved computer science problem at this company. Content organization follows no logical system that human beings can understand. Movies are categorized by genres that don't match viewer expectations. Television shows appear in random order rather than organized by season and episode. New additions to the catalog aren't marked as new, making it impossible to discover recently added content. Popular content gets buried under obscure titles because the sorting algorithms value something other than viewer interest. Video playback represents the culmination of every technical and design failure that makes streaming unwatchable. Click play on a video and wait while the player loads, which takes anywhere from 10 seconds to 5 minutes, depending on mysterious factors that nobody can predict. Once loading completes, enjoy approximately 30 seconds of video before buffering pauses playback while more content downloads. Resume watching for another 20 seconds before the next buffer interruption. Repeat this cycle until you give up or the video ends, whichever comes first. Playback controls don't work the way users expect based on decades of experience with VCRs and DVD players. The progress bar jumps randomly when clicked, sending viewers to unexpected points in the video. The pause button sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Volume control requires multiple clicks to produce any audible change. Full screen mode fails in ways that vary by browser. Operating system and moon phase. Quality settings offer choices between video that looks terrible or video that buffers constantly. Select low quality and watch pixelated video where faces become blurry abstractions and text becomes illegible. Choose high quality and experience buffering interruptions every few seconds that make continuous viewing impossible. The medium quality setting provides the worst of both options. Poor video quality, combined with frequent buffering. Error messages demonstrate the pinnacle of unhelpful communication. Videos that fail to play display messages like Error 2048 with no explanation of what that means or how to fix it. Connection problems produce technical jargon that even IT professionals cannot interpret. Browser compatibility issues generate suggestions to download plugins that don't actually solve the problems. The error handling seems designed to make troubleshooting as difficult as possible while providing minimal useful information. Customer support represents the front line, where user frustration meets corporate dysfunction. Support representatives receive minimal training on technical problems they're expected to solve. The troubleshooting guides provide generic advice that rarely addresses actual issues. Hold times stretch to hours during peak periods because the company employs fewer support staff than problems occurring daily. Representatives can offer refunds, but cannot fix the underlying technical problems causing customer dissatisfaction. The refund rate reveals the scale of customer dissatisfaction. Approximately 40% of new subscribers request refunds within their first month, usually after multiple failed attempts to watch content. Processing refunds requires manual intervention because the automated systems don't work properly. Some refund requests get lost in the system, resulting in customers being charged for months after canceling. The financial losses from refunds approach the revenue from successful subscriptions. Platform abandonment statistics tell the story of catastrophic user experience design. 90% of visitors who create accounts never return after their first attempt to watch content. The 10% who return typically leave permanently after second or third attempts. The tiny fraction who persist through repeated failures become the loyal user base that the company claims proves the business model works. Ignoring that these users represent survivors of selection pressure that eliminated everyone with normal human patience levels. Device compatibility creates additional barriers that make streaming even more inaccessible. The service works best on brand new computers with latest operating systems and fast processors, which excludes most potential customers who own older hardware. Windows XP computers struggle to decode video smoothly. Macs from earlier than last year lack sufficient processing power. Linux support doesn't exist because the development team has never heard of Linux. Television streaming represents the holy grail that everyone wants, but nobody can deliver. Smart TVs don't exist yet. Connecting computers to televisions requires technical expertise that average consumers don't possess. The video resolution optimized for computer monitors looks terrible when displayed on television screens. HDMI standards haven't been developed yet, leaving consumers to struggle with outdated connection technologies. Gaming console partnerships promise to bring streaming to television through Xbox and PlayStation devices, but the implementations fail spectacularly. The consoles lack sufficient processing power to decode streaming videos smoothly. The user interfaces designed for game controllers don't work well for content browsing. Network connectivity on consoles proves even less reliable than on computers. The partnerships produce press releases announcing features that don't actually work in practice. Set-top box experiments attempt to create dedicated streaming devices that make television viewing possible. But the economics make the project impossible. Manufacturing custom hardware costs millions. The devices must be sold at losses to achieve adoption. Technical support for physical products creates expenses that software companies aren't equipped to handle. The few customers who purchase devices return them at rates exceeding 90% because the technology doesn't work as advertised. As your third week ends, you've processed 200 customer complaints, issued 75 refunds, and explained technical problems you don't understand to customers whose patience you deeply admire. The customer satisfaction surveys reveal that users rate the service slightly worse than having teeth extracted without anesthesia. The churn rate indicates that the company loses customers faster than it acquires them, creating growth that's negative despite expensive marketing campaigns. Tonight, you'll go home and think about how the technology industry confuses technically possible with actually usable, and how streaming video represents something that theoretically works but practically fails for most people in most situations. Tomorrow will bring more angry customers, more unexplainable technical failures, and more evidence that creating good user experiences requires solving problems that current technology and organizational capabilities cannot address. The streaming revolution keeps running into the reality that customers don't care about innovative technology. They care about whether things work reliably and simply. And early streaming services fail catastrophically at both requirements. Your fourth week at the streaming startup begins not with customer complaints or technical disasters, but with something far more existential, an emergency all-hands meeting where the CEO announces that the company has approximately 3 months of runway remaining before completely running out of money. Welcome to the venture capital treadmill, where companies burn through millions of dollars monthly while generating revenue that couldn't support a lemonade stand. All while investors demand hockey stick growth that defies mathematical possibility. The quarterly metrics review reveals financial statements that would make accounting professors question their career choices. The company spent $8 million last quarter while generating $300,000 in revenue, creating a burn rate that would bankrupt most countries. Customer acquisition costs average $200 per subscriber, who pays $5 monthly and cancels after an average of 6 weeks. The unit economics indicate that the company loses approximately $175 on every customer it acquires. A business model that technically qualifies as paying people to use your product. Marcus, the chief financial officer, whose collection of stress balls and antacids marks him as someone who spends his days explaining impossible mathematics to people who refuse to accept reality, presents a financial forecast that requires believing in multiple miracles occurring simultaneously. The projections assume that technical problems will be solved. Content costs will decrease dramatically. Customer acquisition costs will drop by 90%. And retention will improve from 6 weeks to 18 months. Even with these heroic assumptions, the company won't achieve profitability for another 7 years. The venture capital pressure manifests through increasingly aggressive board meetings where investors demand growth that cannot be achieved with current resources or technology. The VCs want subscriber counts doubling every quarter, despite the company's inability to deliver acceptable service to current customers. They demand international expansion into markets where broadband internet barely exists. They insist on original content production with budgets that won't cover craft services for legitimate productions. The competitor landscape creates additional pressure as multiple well-funded companies pursue the same impossible vision. YouTube has just been acquired by Google for $1.65 billion. Despite having no revenue model and facing copyright lawsuits that could destroy the company, Hulu launches with backing from major television networks, giving them access to content libraries that independent streaming services cannot license. Amazon enters the market with essentially unlimited capital and willingness to lose money indefinitely while building market share. Pivoting demands from investors reflect their growing panic that the current business model will never work. The VCs suggest moving from subscription to advertising-supported streaming, ignoring that advertisers won't pay meaningful rates for audiences measured in thousands rather than millions. They propose premium tiers with better video quality. overlooking that customers already complain about quality at current pricing. They recommend focusing on mobile, despite mobile streaming being technologically impossible with current devices and networks. Marketing expenditure reveals another dimension of financial insanity, where spending increases without corresponding revenue growth. The company spends $2 million monthly on advertising that reaches audiences who don't understand what streaming is or why they should care. Television commercials demonstrate features that don't actually work reliably. Online advertising targets demographics that lack broadband internet necessary to use the service. The brand awareness campaigns successfully make people aware of a service they cannot successfully use. Customer acquisition costs create a death spiral, where the company must spend more money acquiring customers to replace the customers leaving due to poor service. The marketing team celebrates acquiring 10,000 new subscribers while ignoring that 15,000 existing subscribers canceled during the same period. The net customer growth is negative. But the gross acquisition numbers look impressive in presentations to investors who don't ask about retention rates. Demo disasters occur when executives attempt to showcase the service to potential investors or partners, and the technology fails spectacularly during presentations. Videos buffer endlessly during crucial demonstrations. The website crashes when traffic spikes from people trying to use the service. Error messages appear at precisely the moments when showcasing reliability would be most valuable. These failures make fundraising increasingly difficult, as investors witness firsthand the technical problems preventing the business from succeeding. Press coverage shifts from breathless enthusiasm about revolutionary technology to skeptical analysis of companies burning through hundreds of millions of dollars without viable paths to profitability. Tech journalists, who initially celebrated streaming innovation, now write articles questioning whether video streaming will ever work economically. The negative press makes customer acquisition more expensive and retention more difficult, as potential subscribers read about technical problems and financial instability. Revenue model experimentation produces increasingly desperate attempts to find something that generates sustainable income. The company tries ad-supported tiers, but advertisers pay rates that couldn't fund a high school student's allowance. Premium subscriptions with better quality fail because the quality improvements aren't sufficient to justify higher prices. Pay-per-view rentals cannibalize subscription revenue without generating enough income to offset losses. Bundling deals with internet service providers produce complicated revenue-sharing arrangements that benefit everyone except the streaming company. Partnership negotiations reveal how little bargaining power the company possesses when negotiating with larger technology and media companies. Every partnership discussion involves the partner demanding terms so favorable they're essentially asking the streaming company to pay for the privilege of integration. Device manufacturers want revenue sharing for including streaming apps. Content providers demand guaranteed minimum payments, regardless of viewing. Distribution partners require exclusivity that prevents reaching customers through competing channels. International expansion accelerates financial losses without generating corresponding revenue growth. Each new country requires separate content licensing negotiations with terms even more unfavorable than domestic deals. Translation and localization costs add expenses without increasing willingness to pay. Marketing must be adapted for different cultural contexts and media landscapes. Technical infrastructure must be expanded to serve customers whose internet connections are even worse than American broadband. The result is spending millions to acquire thousands of customers in markets where subscription prices must be lower than domestic rates to achieve any adoption. Team burnout reaches critical levels as employees realize they're working 100-hour weeks for companies that might not survive long enough to make their stock options valuable. The best engineers start interviewing at Google and Facebook, where they can earn actual salaries rather than equity in struggling startups. Business development executives leave for established media companies that offer stability and reasonable working hours. Customer support representatives quit at rates exceeding 50% annually because dealing with angry customers about unfixable technical problems destroys morale and mental health. Founder conflicts emerge as different executives disagree about strategy for saving the company from inevitable collapse. The CEO wants to focus on content acquisition, believing that better content will drive subscriber growth despite ongoing technical problems. The CTO argues for infrastructure improvements, claiming that fixing streaming quality will reduce churn regardless of content availability. The CFO advocates for immediate cost-cutting to extend runway while hoping for technological breakthroughs or acquisition offers. Layoff rounds become regular occurrences as the company attempts to reduce burn rate without abandoning core operations. Each round eliminates positions that seemed essential weeks earlier, but now appear expendable when survival requires cutting expenses. The layoffs create additional problems as remaining employees must absorb responsibilities of departed colleagues while maintaining their own workloads. Morale collapses as everyone updates LinkedIn profiles and interviews with competitors, creating brain drain that accelerates company decline. Exit strategy pressure intensifies as investors realize that their investments are losing value daily and need liquidity before the company burns through remaining capital. The VCs push for acquisition by larger technology companies that could integrate streaming into existing platforms. They suggest mergers with competitors to achieve scale economies that might make the business model work. They hint at fire sale acquisitions where the company would be sold for less than the capital invested, allowing investors to salvage partial returns rather than losing everything. Acquisition discussions reveal that potential buyers view streaming startups as technology assets rather than ongoing businesses. The acquirers want the engineering team and software platform, but not the content deals. Customer base, or business operations. They offer prices that value the company at fractions of invested capital, treating the acquisition as talent acquisition rather than business purchase. These discussions create additional employee anxiety as workers realize their equity will be worth nothing even if acquisition occurs. As your fourth week ends, the company has burned through another $2 million, lost 3 key employees to competitors, and received term sheets from investors that value the company at less than half its previous valuation. The financial models indicate that without significant changes or additional funding, the company will shut down within 3 months. The technology that seemed revolutionary now seems like expensive failure built on infrastructure that doesn't exist and business models that don't work. Tonight, you'll go home and think about how the technology industry confuses vision with viability, and how streaming video represents an idea that's correct about the future, but premature given present reality. Tomorrow will bring more financial pressures, more strategic pivots, and more evidence that timing matters more than technology when building businesses that depend on infrastructure and customer behavior that haven't evolved sufficiently to support new business models. The streaming revolution requires not just innovation but patience, capital, and willingness to lose money for years while waiting for technology, infrastructure, and market conditions to align in ways that make the vision achievable. Your fifth and final week at the streaming startup doesn't begin with crisis or disaster, but with something far more unsettling: the realization that success in the streaming industry required not revolutionary innovation or brilliant strategy, but simply surviving long enough for the rest of the world to catch up to a vision that was correct but impossibly premature. The company has somehow secured another funding round from investors who believe that infrastructure improvements and market conditions will eventually make streaming viable. And you're about to witness the decade-long process of painful, boring progress that transforms impossible dreams into inevitable reality. The infrastructure breakthroughs that make streaming economically viable don't happen overnight or through technological genius. They happen gradually as telecommunications companies reluctantly upgrade networks, as computer processors become powerful enough to decode video efficiently, and as enough consumers adopt broadband internet to create the user base necessary for streaming business models to function. The revolution arrives not with fanfare, but through accumulation of incremental improvements that nobody notices until suddenly streaming works well enough that people stop complaining constantly. Broadband adoption reaches critical mass somewhere around 2010. 5 years after your company started operations, and approximately 4 years after most analysts predicted streaming would become mainstream. The penetration rate crosses 50% of American households, creating for the first time a potential customer base large enough to support subscription streaming services. The bandwidth available to typical users increases from 1 megabit per second to 5 megabits, making video streaming technically possible rather than theoretically conceivable. Cloud computing transforms streaming economics in ways that seem obvious in retrospect, but were impossible to predict when your company launched. Amazon Web Services begins offering server capacity that can scale dynamically based on demand, eliminating the need for streaming companies to maintain expensive infrastructure that sits idle during off-peak hours. The pricing models shift from fixed costs to variable expenses that align with actual usage, making the economics of streaming significantly more favorable, even though the underlying technology hasn't fundamentally changed. Mobile revolution creates entirely new streaming opportunities that didn't exist when the company started. The iPhone launches, and suddenly smartphones have screens large enough for video viewing, processors powerful enough for video decoding, and user interfaces that make streaming feel natural rather than technical. Android follows with similar capabilities distributed across hundreds of device models that bring smartphone ownership to mass-market audiences. The mobile platforms create streaming use cases that desktop computers could never address, driving adoption through convenience rather than superior quality. Smart TV emergence represents the breakthrough that makes streaming feel like a legitimate alternative to cable television rather than computer-based novelty. Television manufacturers begin including internet connectivity and streaming apps as standard features, eliminating the technical barriers that prevented most consumers from connecting streaming services to their primary viewing screens. The integration makes streaming as simple as changing channels, removing the complexity that limited adoption to technical enthusiasts willing to tolerate complicated setup procedures. Content delivery network maturity finally solves the infrastructure problems that made early streaming so unreliable. Akamai, Cloudflare, and other CDN providers develop global networks of servers that can deliver video content with reliability approaching traditional broadcasting. The technology that was expensive and unreliable in 2005 becomes commodity service by 2012, allowing streaming companies to focus on content and user experience rather than solving fundamental infrastructure problems. Algorithm improvements transform recommendation systems from actively harmful to occasionally useful. Machine learning techniques that didn't exist or weren't computationally feasible in the early years begin producing suggestions that sometimes align with viewer preferences. The systems remain far from perfect, but they cross the threshold where recommendations occasionally lead to content discovery rather than exclusively frustrating users. The improvement drives increased viewing and reduces churn as customers find reasons to continue subscriptions beyond initial content that attracted them. Content strategy evolution reflects gradual recognition that licensing Hollywood content will never work economically, and that original content represents the only path to sustainable differentiation. Netflix proves this with House of Cards, spending $100 million on a single season of television and demonstrating that streaming budgets can compete with traditional television production. The success validates the original content strategy and triggers industry-wide shift toward treating streaming as legitimate production platform rather than secondary distribution channel. Binge viewing model discovery happens almost accidentally when Netflix releases entire seasons simultaneously rather than weekly episodes. The approach proves wildly popular with audiences who've been trained by DVD box sets to watch television on their own schedules. The binge model becomes defining characteristic of streaming services and drives subscriber acquisition as people sign up to watch specific shows, then stay subscribed because canceling feels like losing access to content they might want to watch later. International expansion becomes viable as broadband infrastructure reaches critical mass in countries beyond the United States. The technical challenges remain significant but are no longer insurmountable. Content licensing for international markets becomes more feasible as streaming proves successful enough that content owners want access to the revenue streams rather than protecting traditional distribution exclusively. The global subscription base creates scale economies that improve unit economics and make continued losses more tolerable for patient investors. Studio desperation contributes to content availability as traditional media companies recognize that streaming represents genuine threat to their business models and that licensing content might be preferable to losing relevance entirely. The studios that refused to negotiate in 2005 become eager partners by 2015 as they watch DVD sales collapse and recognize that streaming revenue will replace traditional distribution income, whether they participate or not. The power dynamic shifts from streaming services begging for content to studios competing for licensing deals. Cable cord cutting accelerates as younger consumers reject traditional television bundles in favor of streaming services that offer greater flexibility and lower prices. The demographic shift happens gradually but relentlessly as each generation of consumers enters the market with preferences shaped by streaming rather than cable. The migration creates network effects, where streaming becomes more valuable as more people adopt it, driving adoption rates that eventually reach tipping points. Pandemic acceleration in 2020 compresses a decade of gradual adoption into a few months, as lockdowns force everyone to adopt streaming or stare at walls for entertainment. The sudden spike in demand proves that infrastructure has finally reached capacity to handle mass-market usage. The services that survived the decade of losses suddenly find themselves serving hundreds of millions of subscribers, validating the vision that seemed impossible 15 years earlier. Mobile data plan evolution eliminates the bandwidth constraints that made mobile streaming impractical. Carriers shift from metered data plans with punitive overage charges to unlimited plans that treat streaming as expected rather than exceptional usage. The pricing changes reflect recognition that mobile video represents primary use case for high-speed networks and that restricting streaming would reduce the value proposition for expensive data plans. Smart device ubiquity means that by 2020, essentially every screen in people's lives can stream content easily. Televisions, computers, tablets, phones, gaming consoles, and even car displays offer streaming capabilities with interfaces that work reliably. The proliferation of compatible devices eliminates the technical barriers that limited early adoption and makes streaming the default rather than alternative viewing method. Your company, miraculously, has survived long enough to benefit from these infrastructure improvements and market changes. The technology that barely worked in 2005 functions reliably by 2015. The content library that consisted of unwatchable B-movies now includes original productions that win Emmy Awards. The subscriber base that numbered in thousands has grown to millions. The business model that lost $5 per customer now generates positive unit economics and approaches profitability. The reflection on the decade of failure reveals that streaming success required not brilliance or luck, but simply refusing to quit while slowly improving technology, gradually building content libraries, patiently waiting for infrastructure to develop, and burning through billions of dollars in venture capital while hoping that market conditions would eventually align with the vision. The overnight success took 15 years of failure and near-bankruptcy experiences before becoming viable. Market timing convergence represents the critical factor that determines success or failure for technology businesses. The companies that launched too early burned through capital before infrastructure supported their visions. The companies that launched too late missed first-mover advantages and faced competition from established players. The companies that survived long enough for timing to work succeeded not through superior execution, but through having sufficient capital and institutional patience to outlast the years when the business model didn't work. As your final week ends, the company that seemed doomed to failure has achieved the scale and sustainability that validate the original vision. The streaming service that lost money on every customer now generates billions in annual revenue. The technology that barely worked now delivers 4Kelvin's video to hundreds of millions of subscribers simultaneously. The content strategy that couldn't license decent movies now produces award-winning original programming with budgets exceeding traditional studios. Tonight, you'll sleep, knowing that you witnessed one of technology's most important lessons, that being right about the future doesn't guarantee success if you're too early, and that most technology revolutions require boring, gradual infrastructure development rather than sudden brilliant innovations. The streaming revolution that seemed impossible in 2005 became inevitable by 2015. Not because the technology fundamentally changed, but because the world finally caught up to a vision that required patience measured in decades rather than quarters. Tomorrow will bring new challenges as streaming becomes mainstream and faces competition from established media companies launching their own services. But tonight, take comfort in knowing that the decade of losses and near-death experiences has finally produced a business that works, proving that sometimes success requires nothing more than refusing to give up, while the rest of the world slowly develops the infrastructure necessary to make your impossible vision merely difficult. Sweet dreams of instant 4Kelvin streaming, unlimited content libraries, and seamless viewing across all your devices. The streaming services you take for granted required 15 years of failure, billions in losses, and patience that most businesses cannot afford. All to make video viewing so convenient that nobody remembers how impossible it seemed when the journey began.